Thank you, Scott. And thank you to everyone for coming today. I was saying to Scott that I dare say we have more people in this room interested in tanks than in all of Parliament, at least today. When Scott suggested this as a topic for a briefing, I jumped at the opportunity. It's a topic that you can imagine is near and dear to my heart, having spent a lot of time in armored vehicles, including Leopard 1s. So that's the question of the day. And here's the answer of the day. Simply speaking, no, the tank is not dead. But I'll elaborate. So I just want you to understand that my way of giving lectures, normally I wander around. I'm kind of trapped because of this microphone for our recording. But there'll be a question and answer period at the end of the slide deck for general discussion. But if you have a burning question because of something I say during my talk, just raise your hand. And if I'm going to answer it later, I'll tell you. Otherwise, I'm happy to take a question. You don't have to worry about interrupting my train of thought. I don't have one. So let's go on. So here's the outline. I'm going to start with an aim, then I'll give you some background. Then we'll talk briefly about the role of armor and how it's evolved. I'll talk about the vulnerabilities of armor. Then I will draw some conclusions, and then we'll go into a question and answer period. And unfortunately the slide doesn't project very large, but in the red there, this is a picture of a Russian tank column that came under attack in a city in Ukraine in 2022. And if we were to watch the video, you'd see that by the end of the attack, every one of those tanks was killed. So you can see that, with pictures like that in the media, that a lot of people who don't know any better are saying tanks are obviously dead. The drones are killing them, the soldiers in the streets are killing them, and that's just not so. So here's my aim, to explain to you why it's not obsolete, and to also explain to you that, in fact, as a single weapon system, the tank is the most dominant weapon system on the battlefield now and will be for the foreseeable future. And I'll explain why. So, as we know, we live in a multimedia universe. When we were younger, we wanted ground truth. In English papers, we would go to the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Times of London, and some of the higher-end magazines like Foreign Policy or The Economist. And now, a lot of these traditional media sources are dying because people have a shorter attention span. I forget which generation we're at, but call it the 20 and 30-year-olds, whatever generation they are. They have an attention span of approximately a minute and a half. And so they want their news in sound bites. And to fill this need, the web has become full of web pages and podcasts. And guilty as anybody, I have a web page. And I occasionally opine on my web page. The problem is anybody can do that. They don't need any training. All they need is an opinion. Well, remember what we learned from our platoon sergeants? Opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one, right? And that's part of the problem, is that you can see what's going on and you can offer an opinion, but it may not be a valid opinion. And you as a reader, if you don't know anything about the subject, if the person that gives you that opinion sounds credible, then you are inclined to believe it, because that's how we're brought up. You like to give people the benefit of the doubt. If they're telling you something, then you're not going to immediately accuse them of lying, unless, of course, it's the President of the United States. Then it's a different matter. So, I'm sorry, I don't normally read my slides, but I think I'm going to have to for people at the back. So here's Actually, this is a follow-on picture of that very same group of tanks that were going downtown. So there's been considerable speculation in all forms of media on the future of the main battle tank. And lots of photos of burning tanks. And I've got some very interesting ones for us to look at here. But the problem is that a lot of people who are self-declared pundits, some who should know better, some who actually do know something about the subject, have made declarations that the tank is dead, it can no longer fight because of drones, handheld weapons are everywhere, there's no way for armor to survive on the modern battlefield. Proof? Look at this. As of last week, the British Intelligence Service has announced that Russia has lost over 3,000 tanks in the last 2 years. That means they've lost every tank that they had in the army and in storage up to this point. All they have left now is tanks that they're either buying or building. And they build about 12 tanks a month. So their losses have been extraordinary. Right? So if you don't know anything about mechanized warfare, you haven't read my book Praxis Tacticum, for instance, then you could be forgiven for thinking that, well, obviously with these kinds of losses and the losses that the Ukrainians have suffered, this is an unviable weapon system. Not so. As I say on the slide, the beginning of a rain shower is not an indication that we need to build an ark. It's just raining. It's a data point. It's not a trend. So, the way I like to describe it to people who don't know anything about mechanized warfare is that main battle tanks, especially the modern ones, I don't know what generation we're at now, but Leopard 2, M1A2, that type of tank, they're like thoroughbred horses. You have to know how to ride them. And they're very expensive and they're very fussy. And they're bred to do a certain thing, and that is run fast. If you give 2 thoroughbred horses to a man who needs plow horses, those horses will be dead by the end of the day. Not because they're weak, they're not suited to the job. Or the man who's using the horses doesn't know how to use them because he's never seen a thoroughbred before. He's used to farm animals, which are totally different. And that's where we are, I think, with modern battle tanks. Employing armor on the battlefield is like any other weapon system. It's a balance of science and art. And some of my civilian friends find it odd that I use the word art. And I use words like armored vehicles are a terrible beauty, because those of us that have used military equipment know what I mean. There's a certain beauty in a beautifully fashioned weapon. It sounds bizarre, and it's horrible to say it, but we can all appreciate how beautiful a fighter jet is. Or if you've never watched a tank go on a battle run with its gun in full stabilized mode, or an infantry that is doing a mechanized attack, there's a beauty there. That's the art side. But it has to start with the science. You have to understand the science involved in the weapon system, and then when you understand the science involved and its advantages and disadvantages, or its advantages and risks, then you learn to use it in such a way that you maximize the technological advantages and minimize whatever risks may be inherent in that weapon system. And that's why the tank will live on for the foreseeable future. And we'll get into this later. This is something that the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, the feeling between your index finger and your thumb. And it's a word that comes from German, not necessarily from the military, but a carpenter has Fingerspitzengefühl. Right? A painter has that same feeling. It's something that you develop, or if you're very lucky, were born with, that you get to have a feeling, a sense. Agatha Christie's Poirot walks into a room and says, I can feel, I know who the criminal is. He's just walked into the bloody room. How does he know that? It's years of experience of seeing clues, of doing things over and over until you get them right. And you develop this judgment. Right? Well, that's what's lacking today for us to observe in the Russo-Ukraine war. This kind of Fingerspitzengefühl when it comes to armor. The Ukrainians have done some astounding things with drones and also with armor and also with mechanized infantry. But what we haven't seen in this war is we haven't seen armor used the way it should be used, that is, in mass. Tanks were not designed in the last 30 or 40 years to be used individually. They were designed that way when they were invented in 1916. They were designed for a specific purpose, to break through the barbed wire entanglements, to get the infantry across the obstacle, and to support the infantry onto the objective, and that was it. And then, of course, in the 1930s, based on some writing from J.F.C. Fuller, the British Major General, and ostensibly, although I'm not convinced this is true, of Sir Basil Little Hart, the Germans started reading what the Brits were writing, and men like Guderian started thinking, this makes more sense than what we've been doing in the past. To mass the armor, to create that mailed fist that we see on our badge, to punch through and then to drive as far as you can to disrupt the enemy. Doing something like that takes decades of practice, intensive training. I know, because I spent all of my time in the 8th Hussars trying to teach my troops to do just that. And I must admit, we achieved some amazing successes on exercises, but I want to tell you, I just remembered the slide that didn't come up. The slide that didn't come up, it was blank, was a warning to all of you in listening to me, that in the Armored Corps, and we have some senior Armored Corps members with us, in the Armored Corps, I was seen by a lot of people as a heretic, because I had these strange ideas like, yeah, we should take tanks through downtown cities, and tanks should never kill other tanks. That was a big one. General Rad got very angry with me one day when I said that tanks should not waste their time shooting at other tanks. And I'm happy to explain why in the question and answer period. And I trained all of my soldiers from when I was, even when I was in reconnaissance. And Romus may remember this as a discussion when we were students at Staff College. How to disarm or kill Leopard tanks using water balloons, which sounds absurd, but I assure you it can be done. So that's where we move from the science to the art, right? To thinking outside the box, as it were. But thinking outside the box isn't going to solve the problem if you don't train and have the soldiers understand what it is that needs to be done. This is what's lacking in the media today. As I say, sadly, from some very senior people who should know better. But this is nothing new. Right? When aircraft were invented, contrary to what the godfather of all air doctrine, Giulio Douhet, the Italian, wrote in his 1921 book, Command of the Air, land forces did not become obsolete, because that's exactly what he said would happen. Air forces would make land forces obsolete. We would just bomb our enemy into submission. And I know we have some Air Force officers, and I do not mean to offend. My son is an Air Force major. Air doctrine hasn't changed since 1921. We still believe we can bomb them into oblivion and that they'll give up. When submarines were invented, the cry was, battleships are dead. We can't keep battleships at sea because submarines will rule the waves. Hasn't happened yet. We still keep building submarines. We still need submarines. They have a great tactical, operational, and strategic role, but they will never make surface ships obsolete, ever, because that's not what they're supposed to do. And that type of warfare is self-defeating. Again, we can talk about that later. We have a naval expert with us, Jim. And machine guns, right down at the coalface, when the Gatling gun was invented, there was large swaths of militaries around the world that said, this is it, this is the end of infantry. How could infantry ever stand up against a Gatling gun or a machine gun? And yet, we still do. We have machine guns now that fire thousands of rounds a minute, and infantry still attack in the face of such weaponry. It's a question of science and art. Let's look at armor and its role. Okay? So, fundamentally, main battle tanks are designed to destroy armored targets. Those could be tanks, even though I've just said that we shouldn't waste our ammunition shooting at other tanks. But primarily what they should be shooting at, and why I put it in red, is they should shoot at soft targets, like infantry vehicles, artillery command posts. If you're lucky enough to get that deep into the enemy, artillery pieces, which are considered soft targets, right? Because they're equipped with varied weapons systems. They have not only the main gun, they also have secondary weapon systems, and some tanks even have missiles, right? But I have always espoused this role for armor, even though from the very beginning, I remember transferring from the Navy to the Army, going to the armor school, and being told on day one, the role of armor is to support infantry. That was in our doctrine. That was our only role, support infantry. And it didn't take long for me, to start wondering, why were we shooting at other tanks? Why wouldn't we shoot at the infantry? Because if you hit a tank, chances are you're going to disable it. You may not kill the crew, and you may not disable the tank. You may just stop it from moving, and then the gun's going to start firing at you. Whereas if you shoot at infantry with almost any kind of ammunition, if you hit an APC with even the slowest, weakest round that the tank has, you're going to kill the whole section. No one's going to survive that hit. So it would seem to me, still does to this day, and again, we can talk about this during the question and answer, that even though that's what they're designed to do, we're wasting them if we pitch our tanks against other tanks. But lots of other targets for the tanks to hit. So, what's the purpose? So that was the role, but what's our purpose as armored forces? Well, we have a bunch, and we could go on at length, but I picked some of the most important ones. Armor can control key positions and deny enemy access, right? Thereby creating an opportunity for friendly forces to maneuver into a position to defeat the enemy. So this is achieved by armor's ability to absorb shock and hits because they are so well protected, and their ability to either call upon suppressive fire from artillery or use their own weapons to suppress an enemy. They can act as shields, and this is part of our doctrine to this day, everybody's doctrine. When infantry and armor move together, then armor provides the shield for the infantry to advance and not risk them because, as I said, they die in groups, they die in sections. Right? So armor can protect them right up and onto the objective. And just as an aside, as a captain on RV-84, I got the bollocking of my life from the brigade commander, an armored officer, for bringing my tanks, they were Cougars, onto the objective to support the Patricias, because he insisted that I had no role on the objective. And when I disagreed, that's when I got my face ripped off. We support the infantry, of course we do. We're part of the combined arms team. The infantry supports us, We support the infantry, the engineers support both of us, and the artillery supports all three of us. It's just, that's the whole idea of combined arms battle, which is not new. The Germans invented combined arms battle in the 1890s, where you bring more than one weapon system, more than one arm to the battlefield, so that the strengths of one arm can overcome the weakness of the other arm. And then, of course, we have reconnaissance and flanking, which normally we think of is done by lesser vehicles, that is to say, less armored vehicles or vehicles with smaller weapons. But for those of us that served in Germany during the Cold War, you might remember that the Germans used Leopard 1 as reconnaissance vehicles, as well as battle tanks. Now, they had reconnaissance vehicles as well. They had Luchs and Fuchs that were both wheeled and tracked to do light reconnaissance, but they always supplemented their reconnaissance vehicles with tanks, because our doctrine said we would sneak and peek until somebody with a 9mm showed up, and we couldn't protect ourselves, because that's the most that we could protect ourselves with, 9mm. After that, then we had to run or die. If we had tanks with us, then we could at least save our own skin, because the tanks would protect us as we withdrew. So, to summarize the purpose, right? To engage the enemy, obviously. That's all of our mission when in combat. To control key positions, and I put there temporarily because armor cannot hold ground. We can take a position, we cannot hold it. We need the infantry to join us to hold that ground. But if you only need it temporarily, then you can use just armor. But don't count on holding it, because when the enemy infantry shows up, we have to leave. Protect vulnerable members of the combat team, whatever they may be, to absorb shock and damage that the enemy will inflict. Again, to support the infantry, as I said before, to conduct reconnaissance and flanking movements, and to provide fire support. And even to this day, although it is not a preferred role for armor, armor can act as temporary artillery, right? It is very inaccurate and not nearly as good an idea as using artillery to fire indirect, but armor can fire, we call it semi-indirect, because we actually have to watch the fall of shot. Okay? So an extremely versatile weapon system in terms of all of its functions: protection, signals, command and control, shock action, maneuver. They're all embodied in this one weapon system, in a single vehicle. Let's look at the vulnerabilities. So that's if I'm not mistaken, that's a T-90. Someone who's better at armored vehicle recognition can correct me. A Russian vehicle trapped in a Ukrainian village and was hit by a handheld anti-tank weapon, and I don't think the crew survived. I think the picture after this one is the turret blowing off, which, back to the science, the Russians built tanks a certain way, Americans build tanks a certain way, British. Every country has its own idea of what's important, because there are three aspects to the science of building a tank. It's speed, it's protection, and it's firepower. And you cannot maximize all three. If you maximize protection, it's going to slow the vehicle down. If you maximize speed, then you're doing it at the cost of armor protection, and depending on how big a gun you want, it offsets the other two. So somewhere you find a balance, and you can see it in something like, if I go back 2 generations, look at the difference between a British Chieftain, which is a monstrous Class 60 tank, with a 120mm gun, moved at the speed of a snail. I served in Chieftains on exchange for about 10 weeks, and I think the fastest I got, well, apart from the time that I knocked the crew out because we were going downhill and I lost control of the tank, other than that, the fastest we got in the Chieftain was about 6 kilometers an hour. But the tank was designed to move out onto the North German plain, stand, and say, "Bring it on, Ivan, because we can take as many hits as you can give us." Because their armor was surpassed by no one. No one had better than what the Brits had at that time, their Cobham armor, which was their layered ceramic armor. And their 120 millimeter gun was accurate to 5 kilometers. So it was designed specifically to protect the North German plain. And the Brits did not at that time believe in maneuvering large forces. The Germans, on the other hand, built the Leopard 1, which had almost no armor on it, was incredibly fast. I remember moving my squadron up the Autobahn at 70 kilometers an hour, okay, praying that a German wouldn't be in his Mercedes when we came around the next curve. And then the Americans tried to cut the baby in half with their M1, with their high-powered turbine engine, their 120 millimeter gun, and their extra armor. And they moved just as fast as the Leopards and had just as much firepower as the Chieftains. And the Americans, of course, didn't think in terms of companies or battalions of tanks. They thought in terms of divisions and corps. Right? So they needed tanks that would move quickly and do all of that at the same time. So you've got to understand, there's the science. Different countries look at it different ways. And once you get the science, then you have to decide, how am I going to use these weapon systems? That's the art. Right? So here are some of the more obvious vulnerabilities for armor. We cannot defend against dismounted infantry. There is just no way. If an armored officer tells you that he can protect his tank against dismounted infantry, he either has never served on a tank or he doesn't know what he's talking about, because it can't be done. Right? I remember he commanded 2 Brigade. He left 2 Brigade just before I arrived in 77. Kip Kirby. Kip Kirby used to say, all I need to destroy an armored regiment is a bayonet. Right? Get in and you reach in and cut the commander's throat. Because, of course, we were famous for not wanting to drop our hatches. Right? Obviously, General Kirby was making a point. We are vulnerable to infantry. Mines. We have mine rollers, we have mine plows, we have electronic removing devices. The engineers have a whole panoply of ways to get rid of mines. But, as we learned again in Afghanistan, you can knock out a tank with a mine. Whether it's ersatz, whether it's an improvised device, or whether it's a tank mine that's specifically designed. Now, chances are you will not kill the entire crew. Chances are you'll blow the track off. And that's when the infantry go and carve the tank up like a Christmas turkey. Anti-armor devices. Here's the reason why I taught all of my students and my subordinates the heresy that we should not waste our time fighting tanks. Because anti-tank rockets are much better at killing tanks than tank guns are. Tank guns are more accurate, tank guns are faster, and tank guns can reach out slightly further. But it's a waste. It's a waste because when you start picking on the other tanks, you stop doing what you should be doing, which is destroying the infantry. And like I say, when we get into the question and answer period, I can give you a scenario. And the other thing that we have great trouble with, and as you've seen in all modern wars, particularly in Afghanistan, close air support and drones are a real threat. Are they a terminal threat? No, by no means. We've always had a problem protecting from the air. Remember in the Second World War that we came up with Typhoon rockets to hit German tank columns on the road. Because the armor on the top of a tank is almost non-existent. It's very, very thin. The two places that you want to shoot a tank, if you have an option, is either on the top or in the rear, right? Because the exhaust panels are there for the engine and the hatches are at the top. So we are very vulnerable from air attack. But there are technical and there are tactical solutions that obviate all of these vulnerabilities. And that's when we've moved away from science and over to art. But what's the solution with all of these vulnerabilities and all of these advantages? Well, the solution is, as I've already indicated, the combined arms theory. And I won't bore you with the actual definition. In a nutshell, it says, you build on the strength that you have in your arm, and in Canada we consider 4 branches to be combat arms: armor, infantry, artillery, combat engineers. The Americans add attack helicopters. You take the strength that your weapon system offers, and then you apply it to the combined arms team to obviate the weakness that one or more of those members may have. So, armor weakness is vulnerability to infantry. Infantry is part of the team to protect you for that reason. Right? If you're going on the offense, then infantry has a weakness, doesn't have enough protection. Armor provides that protection. It should be self-evident. So, for those of you who don't know what that beautiful picture on the upper left is, that's a armor-piercing, fin-stabilized sabot round, APFSDS, discarding sabot. So that little thing that looks like a rocket, that's either depleted uranium or tungsten carbide steel. That one in particular is depleted uranium. The tip is depleted uranium, not for the reason that some people assume, not to irradiate the target that you hit. It's because depleted uranium is harder than tungsten. So it is loaded into the tank. That sits on top of a cartridge, or, depending on the gun, a couple of bags of propellant. And when the gun is fired, it leaves the barrel at hypersonic speed. Right? It's hard to believe unless you've stood next to a tank when it's firing. So there's a shock wave that goes out, and this thing leaves the barrel. I won't bore you with numbers. I don't remember exactly the speed, but say about twice the speed of a bullet that leaves a pistol. Okay, and that keeps a flat trajectory for at 120 millimeters, the bore of the gun. At 120 millimeters, the trajectory of that missile, that is the sabot, the shoes, fall away, and it's moving downrange. And for 3 kilometers, it will only drop maybe 1 or 2 inches. That's how fast and how much kinetic energy it has. Okay? When it hits the target, that will literally drill a hole the size of, I don't know, a small cucumber into the armor of another tank, go inside, and when it gets inside, there are one of 2 possibilities. The possibility you pray for, as someone who's just been hit, is that it goes in one side and it goes through, doesn't hit anything, and goes out the other side. If it hits anything at all, including a piece of paper, it starts to bounce around inside the tank. And what's left inside the tank is not human anymore. General Bradley Walters, who was first CO of my regiment and Colonel Commandant, Colonel for many, many years, he used to carry a picture in his wallet. It was a picture of his tank in Normandy. And I remember telling 2 American second lieutenants who were visiting us on exercise that General Rad had survived such a hit. It had 13 holes in it. The tank that he was commanding. It was a Sherman, had 13 holes, and he said, I got my whole crew out except for the gunner. The gunner was killed. But he said, it was Normandy, and I got everybody out, and we survived. But we went back and took a picture, and he carried it in his wallet. I remember the American second lieutenants, they didn't call me a liar, but they didn't believe it. We were at a barbecue, and I called General Rad over, and I introduced him to my 2 colleagues, and I asked him, did he have his picture? And he pulled it out of his wallet, and there was a little black and white photo of his Sherman with 13 of these holes created by German sabot rounds. Okay? An incredibly effective killing weapon. But imagine that hitting an infantry vehicle with 10 soldiers in it. So what's the future of armor? Well, these slides, no? Well, this slide is supposed to build, but it isn't going to, so we won't worry about it. But basically, technology will continue to improve, and the science will continue to improve, and we'll see tanks that can go faster, tanks that can shoot further, tanks that have automated systems within it. More and more armies are moving to 3-man crews with autoloaders, not a fan. Russians started this a long time ago, not had a lot of success with it. The French have moved to it, and the Americans are thinking about it. But I don't like it. Maybe it's just a prejudice. 4-man crew, I like to have a loader that's a human being, commander, driver, and gunner. Right? So technology will continue to improve the weapon system indefinitely. What needs to be improved indefinitely is our ability to understand how to employ them, right? Because that's the key. Let's look at a case study real quick. So in the Gulf War, first Gulf War, the Americans deployed 1,500 Abram A2s against 4,000 Soviet tanks. 4 days later, there were almost no Soviet tanks left. They had killed them all. The American losses, I think they lost 3 tanks, but no crewmen. So they were struck, but the crews were saved because of the technology built into the Abrams. One of my regimental officers served in that war in a British regiment, in the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars. He told me one day that they got to a point where his squadron, he was a captain, his squadron commander, squadron leader, had ordered the squadron to stop firing because they were not, the Iraqis were not fighting back. They were being killed so rapidly. They were so demoralized. They were trying to surrender. And so they stopped firing because it got to him. It was so pitiable to see what was happening. When they drove to the objective that they got to, they found T-72s that were dug in behind berms, those mounds of earth, with the gun just above the berm. And the British gunners, firing the 120 Chieftain, very quickly came to realize that they should aim just below the top of the berm. Because what they were finding was the 120 millimeter sabot that you saw was going into the sand, through the sand, hit the frontal armor of a T-72, go through the crew compartment, go through the engine block, and come out the back. And that was being done at just under 2 kilometers. That's how powerful the weapons were. So, here's my elevator pitch. Right? So, MBTs combine, their continued value lies in versatility, survivability, firepower, and the ability to adapt to any evolving technology. So, modern tanks are increasingly offering active armor, so armor that explodes and pushes the weapon away. They can have shock effect, they can take on armored targets, creating both physical and psychological shock effect. One of the things I used to train the infantry in 4 Brigade on was that we used to put them in trenches, and then I would assault them with a squadron of Leopard tanks. And talking to the young soldiers afterwards, including warrant officers who had been in the Army decades, they said it took everything that they could muster not to get up out of the trench and run. Because the ground, and I have been on that receiving end. In fact, those of you that know Chris Corrigan, Chris and I sat in a trench at Bergen-Hona and were assaulted by the Queen's Royal Irish Battle Group, and they rolled over us. And I was a lieutenant, Chris was a captain, and I'm not shy to say that I damn near wet myself. Because when the tanks were 100 meters away, the Earth was moving like an earthquake. That's shock effect. Right? So technology keeps increasing, as I've said, and conventional warfare is based on securing terrain, which cannot be done without main battle tanks. So critics point to the vulnerabilities without understanding the advantages that I've tried to point out to you. So I want you to consider. So you and a journalist visit a tank division. Your host shows you 500 tanks, fender to fender in the tank hangars. The message is clear: don't mess with us. The journalist writes a piece in the New York Times explaining how powerful this country is, how dangerous. You, a professional tank officer, note that not one of those tanks has been moved since they were built 20 years ago. Those 500 tanks are scrap metal. This is not theoretical. This is me visiting the garrison at Marienberg when the wall came down. 500 tanks that had not been moved since the day they arrived from Russia. None of them would start. So, artillery, another example. You're sitting with a group of journalists in bleachers, 500 artillery barrels fire, and literally lift 4 or 5 acres off the ground. If you've never seen it, it is a thing of beauty. It's terrifying, right? You literally take 4 or 5 acres of land and lift it off the ground. That's the firepower that artillery can bring to bear in a very short time, in a very short space, right? Journalists write pieces explaining how artillery makes modern war untenable. Who could survive that? You explain that it's suppressive fire and that all trained infantry know how to survive exactly what I've just described. Art and science. So, my final point. So, yeah, again, the slide isn't coming up, but basically what I'm saying here is that until we come up with a better way to move over all terrain with devastating firepower and accuracy and protection, including shock action, the main battle tank is here to stay, right? In the meantime, we need to relearn the lessons that we've lost, because we're not seeing those lessons applied, thankfully on the Russian side, in the Ukrainian war, because they're making all the mistakes over and over and over again. There's no need for a tank column ever to be lost, right? This is a low-level conflict, even though it involves 2 nations at war. So, here's a closing thought for you. I mentioned to you that we're vulnerable to drones and air weapons. This is the latest weapon in the American arsenal. It's called the Leonidas. It's an air defense radar that fires lasers and is specifically designed to kill drones. And it's the number of drones that it can strike at one time is classified, but in open sources, they're talking about at least 24 all at once. And they are currently being fielded in the U.S. CENTCOM to move with tank forces so that they don't need to worry about drones ever again. So, the one slide that didn't come up was my point was, what is the single most important part of a tank? Answer, the crew. Exactly. Not the technology. Okay. We have 25 minutes or so for questions. Floor is open. Thank you.
To add to Chuck's point about the valley and bring it into the context of the little old Vancouver Island. Next time you get off BC Ferries at Tsawwassen, go down the ramp, and turn to the right, and there are the stoplights. And that long causeway. That causeway is 2 kilometers. At the end on the south side is a hotel. Pick a window. Think 2 o'clock in the morning, no ambient light, raining, a little bit of sleep, some fog, doesn't matter. You're in a Leopard 2 Canadian tank, and blink, and a round has gone through one of those windows. So next time you're on the ferries, and consider that is what we have. have right now, the one that's being developed in the next generation, is even better, further, and more accurate.
And watch out for the left coast lens as you hang out.
We're a deadly bunch.
So, next that was great. Now, you headed up the crew, the artists. How are we doing at recruiting and paying people to stay long enough to become the artists?
Not well. I wish I could give you better news. So I said my son was an Air Force officer. My other son is a major in the Armored Corps and has spent 2 tours at the recruit school. And he's now he's the G3 of a reserve brigade. So he's at the coalface. And part of the problem is lack of equipment, lack of serviceable tanks. It's hard to motivate young crewmen if you keep promising them training on tanks and there aren't any. Part of it is general recruiting, which is a multifaceted problem, partly because of our policies. Most of the people in this room would not be accepted in the current recruiting center because our skin is too pale and we are male. It makes me furious, my sons both have friends who run recruiting centers and they want to weep. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, just the general malaise in the armed forces because some of you may have seen my post that I posted about 10 days ago, both on Facebook and on my own webpage. And I still have hope for the future because we are still attracting the brightest, the best, the eagerest, the most intelligent. We just don't have enough of them. And once they come in, they lose heart. And you can understand why. So the answer to your question is not very well. Jim, did you have a question?
Yes, brilliant performance, Chuck. Thank you so very much. Most enlightening. You began with that iconic photograph of the Russian tank column. Did the Russians, as far as you know, learn anything from the Iraqi experience? Did they attempt to address their tank doctrine in the interval? How is it that they entered the war in 2022 so ill prepared?
No. It's a cultural problem. So, as you recall, all of us who are avid readers, we've been reading for decades that Putin rebuilt the armed forces. Look at all these shiny toys. What he didn't rebuild was Russian military culture. In Russian military culture, their doctrine has always been to attack in waves, to attack en masse, which they did brilliantly when they turned the tide on the Germans. I mean, was it Kursk? They did a counterattack of 120 divisions. Nobody in this room can have a mental picture of what 120 divisions looked like. Right? They gave all that up. They built a military that was full of cronyism, full of the belief that their technology was unsurpassed, ignoring what their specialists had been telling them because they wanted more weapons as opposed to better weapons. I think we're seeing the same thing now. There's a reason that there are no Russian aircraft over Ukraine. They don't dare. Right? They claim to have a Generation 5 fighter. We haven't seen it. If they truly had a Generation 5 fighter, it would be unstoppable over Ukraine. Hasn't shown up yet. So, but they're not alone. We all forget. Right? I remember coming back from Staff College in Kingston and having learned all the lessons, but astounded at the fact that I had been given by my directing staff an after-action report from 12th Armored Brigade in Italy that said we needed to get better at combined arms, that the infantry and the armor needed to work more closely together, that operating independently just wasn't working against the Germans. Well, in 1984, we still didn't have that down. Right? You would have thought, well, our guys bled for this lesson. We should have incorporated it into our doctrine. And we did in writing. We just never did in practice. Perfect example. As the CO of the 8th Hussars in Germany, of course, it was my duty to give tanks to the 2 infantry commanders so that they could train for Fall-X before we all went out and did our thing. I remember my squadron commander calling me on the radio in the training area, and he was nearly in tears because the commanding officer of the battalion that he was attached to would not let his tanks lead the battle group. And I said, well, calm down. He's probably walking. No, he was leading with his 113s, and he was keeping the armor in reserve for the counterpunch. As opposed to doing what our doctrine said, whenever mounted, armor leads. But he was the CO, and there wasn't anybody who didn't tell him differently. So I phoned my brother's CO, and I got an earful telling me to mind my own business. And that happened in both battalions. So it wasn't cultural, because one was a French battalion and one was an English battalion. It was cultural in that they were infantry officers who absolutely refused to change their way of thinking.
Thank you.
And then you after. Yeah. You first.
Thanks, Carl. You brought me back a lot of memories. Great memories. Question though, I joined 2 years after, in the Hussars, 2 years after a huge NATO exercise in Norway, approximately 86,
Yeah.
somewhere around that time. The doctrine then was to, if war had broken out, was to move everything into Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Canada was to go into Norway. So that time also they were saying your survivability, you were expected to live perhaps 90 minutes. Was this rumor or was this some bravado where, hey, go in and good luck type thing? But never really understood that. Thanks again.
So lots and lots of combat studies. The one study that I always used to push to my subordinates was, yes, we have a very low survivability rate in our first engagement, right? But the statistic, if I remember it correctly, was if you survived your first encounter, your chances of surviving your next encounter was up by 50%. And every time you survived an engagement, it went up by 50%. So if you know anything about calculus, it can never reach 100, right? But it becomes exceptionally high because every time you survive an engagement, you learn something, right? So that 90-minute number was based on your first engagement, right? And that was true whether it was our infantry in Norway or our armor in Central Europe. You had to survive that first encounter. If you could survive that first one, then your chances of living on got better and better and better. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
The Swedish tank, the Red Lion, I think it's called, the 122.
Yes?
It's supposed to be sort of the state of the art. Could you describe its features and why is it state of the art?
Well, I don't. In the last 10 years, I'll be honest with you, I stopped reading about tank mechanics and tank technology for a very stupid reason. It just upset the hell out of me, thinking that these advancements were being made and we weren't on that train. I don't know an awful lot about the new Swedish tank. It is certainly touted as state of the art in terms of fire control systems, the gun on it. It's got a very maneuverable, very maneuverable suspension system and a very powerful engine. The Swedes build. I drove a Saab for many years. They build outstanding mechanics. So I think the the corollary to your question, Mike, is there's no such thing as a bad tank with the exception of those built in Russia. Korea, they're just Russian copies, right? But the South Korean tank, the Poles just put in an order for a couple of hundred South Korean tanks, which are, they look at first glance like an M1A3, but they're not. They are a derivative, and from the accounts in American journals, they're very well made and very good tanks. David?
Hi, that picture is a bank in a wooded area.
Yes.
I recall from working in Greenway, the tanks don't like to be in the woods.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That's actually a leopard 2 in Gagetown, so-called snow leopard. But yeah, we don't like to be in wooded areas. We don't like to be in cities. And so when I was a young officer in training, we tried avoiding those things. The problem was that sooner or later you had to go into them, and without training on what to do in them, then you were at a loss. I don't know if that's still true. I honestly don't, because I know the school in Gagetown has trouble keeping enough tanks on the road to do a lot of training. But our doctrine does say that, of course, you can employ armor anywhere, but avoid built-up areas and avoid wooded areas, because you're so vulnerable. You're extremely vulnerable if you happen to be closed down, right? Because we do about 95% of our training hatches up. So the commander is up 360 degrees of view, the gunner is looking through the sights, right? And so the commander has an excellent situational awareness of where he or she is relative to every other piece on the battlefield. In woods, that shrinks to inches. Right? Going into woods without infantry protection is suicidal. There's no quick maneuver through woods. And you've got to stay on tracks. So it's completely predictable. If the enemy knows that you've gone into a wood on a track, he knows exactly where you're coming out, because you have no option. You can't go between the trees. So it's a high-risk environment, but is it doable? Absolutely. And in fact, Battle of the Bulge, right? The Americans were convinced that the Germans could never come through the woods. Guess what?
Yeah, just in reference back to you talking about the threats to tanks, and you talked about the 3,000 tanks the Russians lost. Amazing number. Do you have any sense of what the relative breakdown, like what are the great tank killers, and has it changed over the course of the war? I mean, we saw 2022, you saw the javelins and so forth, but I'm assuming you don't see those shots anymore. Is it more drones that are killing tanks, or is it just a whole mix of them?
Well, my understanding, based on only open source reading, so I have no int other than open source reading, is that the number one killer of the Russian tanks remains the javelin. Number two is the drone, because the Ukrainians have just gotten so good at dropping single bombs from drones. The Russians finally caught on and built those cages. Right? I believe the number 3 is handheld, and the number 4 is tanks. Right? But the real killer of Russian tanks is their stupidity. Right? I mean, to the perfect example, it's got to be if we had a master of arts in tank warfare, we would all study the case study of, remember that very first tank column that came out of Russia and crossed into Ukraine that was 40 kilometers long? And they lost every single tank to a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers with handheld weapons. They killed the first tank, then they killed like the 10th tank, then they killed the last tank, and nobody could move. And then they walked down the column and started killing them one at a time. I mean, it was an armored officer's wet dream, or I should say an infantry officer's wet dream, an armored officer's nightmare. Right? But there was no need for that. Right? No need for that.
Let me ask a supplemental question.
By all means.
War, there was a lot of discussion that the Russians had greatly improved their tactics. They had finally cracked the problem. We were no longer this mass conscript army of just throwing heat waves at NATO, and yet when they finally get into action, they fall to pieces. So this odd.
They had no.
How did we miss that?
Well, oh, you,
Not you, but I mean.
no.
The analyst community.
Don't get me started on intelligence community. Because during the first Gulf War, I was a brand new lieutenant colonel in CFE headquarters, and I had the only guy who had a higher security clearance than me was the commander. I was his advisor on arms control, and of course my job went away when the war started. He called me and said, "You don't have a job, Chuck. I don't know what you're going to do till the war's over." Assuming it would last months, right? 10 days, I had a job again. But I went to a briefing, and without going into any detail, the int captains who were briefing the commander explained that we could expect casualties in the Gulf War to be extraordinarily high because the Iraqis had the second or first largest tank army in the world, and they had just spent 8 years fighting the Iranians. So they were experienced, they were blooded, they were ready to go. It was going to get nasty. And after everybody else questions, I raised my hand and I asked the int briefer, could he please explain to me what staff colleges the German or the Iraqi general staff had gone to, and could they fight a two-front war? And did they understand the concepts of operational art? And the answers were, they don't have a staff college. Every general is related to the boss. Right? And they don't recognize the operational art. And the result was 10 days later, it was all over Rome.
Thanks, Chuck. Just some observations, if I may, as opposed to a question. That 50-kilometer column that was going down to Kiev from Russia, there were a couple issues with that. First, it was the mud season.
Right.
Nothing was going to have to leave those hard-pounding roads. So stupidly, they stuck on the road. But the beauty of this one, and I really love this, the reason why they got balled up like that is because nobody had brigade control radio traffic orders that we would move in Wainwright or Germany or anything else like that. Remember the massive movements of divisions? There's actually radio control, traffic control, military police conducting it. There was none of that on that road, and nobody could talk to the vehicles in front of them, and they just very calmly, because you remember, the first day it was 10 kilometers long, then it was 20 kilometers long, and then it was 50 kilometers long. They just bumped into each other. And that area north of Hostomel Airport, the Ukrainians blew all the dams and did a Dutch World War II thing and flooded the whole area. They couldn't do that. The other thing is, in our training, you've always seen the old pictures, and including prior to the Russian invasion, the mass extended lines of the tanks going across fields and all the rest of that. Did you see any of that in the Ukrainian war? None. Two reasons. Well, a couple more than two reasons. First was the attackers during the mud season. Right about now, they've killed enough Russians that no longer know anything about combined arms training to do those extended fields. But also more succinctly, and this is going to be our problem, not just armor. If you're seeing a Russian tank column or vehicles in single file, usually with the lead vehicle dropping blades, rollers, whatever, trying to clear it until they run over not one or two, but 3 stacks of mines that just blows everything to smithereens. The reason why they're going in single tracks is because they've got limitations on how much mine clearing equipment they've got. And the issue that we had in our staff colleges, for example, remember the enemy green slime that we put on the map, the barbed wire, the minefields, etc. Those minefields are sometimes 600 kilometers deep, maybe a kilometer wide, a series of minefields. That's not reality. The minefields that they are using in Ukraine right now are 20, 30, 40 kilometers deep. There's the famous minefield that the Germans ran into in Russia that was 120 kilometers deep. What mine plow, what roller, what miklik, which is that flying garbage can that carries explosive fuse to clear the minefield, what have we got in either their inventory or our own inventory, and what have we got in our own staff college discussions that addresses that problem? And unfortunately, the answer to that is none.
Thanks, Romus. Here and then David. So,
The Soviets had a statement that quantity is its own quality.
right.
And so arguably, the Russian tanks were well designed for the Soviets.
Right.
Unfortunately, the Russians are using the tank, and it's not well designed for the lack of quantity.
Right. So if you didn't hear it at the back, the point was that the Russians, the Soviets used to say that quantity has a quality all its own, which is true. And the point there being that they designed a tank for that doctrine, which is also true. And if they decided to do a mass attack with T-72s, then they could afford to have bad tanks, because there would just be so many, we would run out of ammunition. That's not how they're employing them. They're employing them incorrectly, and therefore the art is not taking into account the science. David?
First, I'd like to congratulate my colleague here, a colleague who's sensible enough to recognize the middle school of all Canadian quality signals. Second, as a teacher at the signal school in 1963, a little committee was being formed to solve the problem of contacting and staying in contact with tanks on the battlefield, because the suckers are moving everywhere. You have us, the thank you for cell phones.
Yes?
The government changes, there's the opportunity for people to be army. What advice would you give Angus Ross to units in that amendment? What advice would you give about rebuilding the army from scratch?
Well, we talked about this briefly before we walked in here, and I don't want to avoid your question, but it is such a complex issue. You know, it's based on culture, it's based on recruiting, it's based on equipment, it's based on funding, leadership, training, doctrine. What to do first? My advice to Angus is get elected. You're in the right party. Move from there. Last question?
Inviting comment. Use of tanks on soft targets, like you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
As an avid YouTuber now, I've watched a video of a pair of Ukrainian tanks grinding up Russians cowering in their trenches. So they're using their tracks as weapons, as well to cave in the defensive position, and anybody still working in the trench system.
Yep. Yep. I've seen the same video, Bill. And my only comment to that is that the Ukrainian tankers are damn lucky that the Russians are such bad soldiers. Right? Because if the infantry that are being run over by tanks knew what they were doing, those tanks would be dead.
And the Russians, for that matter, have been crying, again on YouTube, some soldiers illicitly posting videos of themselves begging for ammunition. And they have no anti-tank ammunition or RPGs anymore.
Right.
Soon.
Thanks, Bill. Scott?
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Give Chuck a few minutes.